Hello there, and welcome to this Ricochet example video and file. If you are watching this on YouTube, then you might want to check the link in the description to go to the Ricochet examples page where I have scene files and different videos on how to use Rocket Lasso's Ricochet. In this video, we're going to be creating a web effect. To start out with, I've got this text object with the letter R. You can type anything in you want, or you could create any kind of model and have that be the target. And that is just fed into a connect object to make sure everything is welded together. Now I need the Ricochet. Under extensions or plugins, you'll find your Ricochet. If you don't already own Ricochet, make sure you go and buy that. Creating Ricochet, I create this line that's shooting out into space. I want this to scoot off to the side, and what I would like to do is have that aim directly at this letter. So right-clicking on the Ricochet, add an animation, target tag. What are we going to target? Well, let's target a null, which I name target. Selecting the tag, I'll drag this in as the target object. And as soon as I do, you see the Ricochet is now aiming straight through this letter R. And that's because it's not colliding with it. It hasn't been told what it interacts with. So inside of the Ricochet, under the main Ricochet tab, currently we could feed it a child, but that would make the letter R move around. I don't want that to happen. So instead, we'll set it to source geometry of objects. And now I can remote into an object. In this case, it will be the text. And as soon as I do, we now have a Ricochet that's bouncing off of that surface. Good start so far. So it's great to get this bounce, but making a web, that's not what we need this time. So instead, I'll change our mode from length to count. I want a count of 1. What that means is that if it finds an object, it will create a connection to it. And if it could bounce off it and hit something else, it would make a secondary connection. But now we've limited it to 1. The advantage of this is if I were to take this target and move it away, you see we're hitting the letter R, but if I move it really far away, if it misses the letter R, it just doesn't generate it at all. And that's what this entire web technique is based off of. So resetting that back to the center point. The other cool thing is we can grab this Ricochet and move it around wherever I want. And it's also continuing to target that null, but still strikes the letter. If I hide that letter, you can see right there, it is colliding. And you can see that indeed it does terminate right where it hits the text. Looking good so far, but now I think we need some curve in here, as if gravity is affecting the web. We don't want a perfect straight line. So what I'm thinking is first, let's subdivide this line. Right now there's just that first point and the last point. So under spline in Ricochet, we could enable, and now we get our intermediate points. Currently it's linear, so I'll say linear subdivided. And the angle, I want to crank it to max, which is 90. And then the maximum length, I'll say 15, which is a good spacing here. You'll see it once we deform it. And it needs to get deformed. And that will happen through a MoGraph plane effector. It's like an effector. Why would we use an effector? Well, an effector can be used as a deformer. Dropping the plane as a child of the Ricochet, I can say deformation will be set to point. And the instant that I do, the entire thing is going to jump up into the air. Now, I don't want to forget that this is a deformer, so I will rename it plane.deform. Now, it's possible that you noticed that this did not move straight up and down. It actually moved at sort of an angle. And that is because under parameter, our transform space is set to node. And node means it's kind of aligned with the points on this object. So what that means, and you'll see it here, if I change my effector strength, it is not moving straight up and down, but kind of aligned to being perpendicular to the line that we've generated. So I don't want it to do that. I want it to transform based on the effector's position. Currently, though, this effector, yes, it's zeroed out, but it won't be once we move that Ricochet. So what I would like to do is put this Ricochet into a null, hitting Alt-G, it'll put that into a null. The null can be named main thread, and then the deformer can be made a child of that. If I select the main thread, turn to my axis mode and say, hey, I don't want any rotation. That should zero it out to world 0, 0, 0. And then this plane deformer can also be at 0, 0, 0. And no matter where I move around this main thread, it means it's not rotating. And now you'll see, if I select that plane deformer, I can change the strength. And now it's moving straight up and down. Now, I don't actually want it moving up. I would like it to go down. So under parameter, I'll say instead of going positive 100, it will go negative 100. So the entire thing is moving straight down, which is great, but of course we don't want the entire thing moving down. We only want the middle to sag. So to do this fancy thing, which is just so neat, I'm so happy we can do this in cinema, inside of the fall off, I would like to feed the Ricochet in as this field. Dragging it in, it's going to ask if we want spline or point. I want spline. And the instant that I do that, you'll even see it kind of pop in and out. The first part is jumping straight up to exactly where the null is, the origin. And that is happening because this ricochet, if we select it, we've got this layer tab. Inside layer, it is following the curve going from 0% and mapped all the way up to 100%. So here's 0 mapped all the way to 100. But we can remap that using follow curve fall off. So at the beginning, I want this to be all the way at the bottom. Everything's at 0. No effect from the deformer. I want the end to have no effect from the deformer. But in the middle, I want full power from this deformer. And you'll see that this exact shape that I made is now mirrored pushing down. So working really nicely. We just need to make a nice arc for ourselves. So selecting the first point, we'll make that pretty sharp. Last point, make that sharp as well, and just get a nice smooth curve from the center point. And that arc is now represented throughout the entire line. What's really cool is selecting the main thread, I can move that around, and now no matter where I move, I'm still targeting the R, but we arc straight down. Even if I move below, if I move above, the curve always pulls downward, and that's exactly what I want to have happen. All right, next step. I would like to make some secondary webs that spin off of this first one. To do that, I'll create a matrix object. The matrix should be set to object mode. The object will be this ricochet line, so I'll drag that in. You know what, something that's a good idea? We should rename some things. So we got that main thread. Let's also call this ricochet main thread. And you know what? It's not a bad idea even to rename this deformer main thread. So later on, if we have a bunch of them, we can search for main thread and work just on that one. But anyway, back to the matrix. This matrix is creating 10 different points for the matrix, traveling fully along that ricochet line. A couple cool things we can do. First of all, turn off loop. So it's going to be going the full span. And now we can determine where that matrix is by changing the start and end point. And you can add in some randomness if you want to by grabbing the offset. And let's do maximum variation. As I increase the offset, you see they're all going to vary a little bit. You can even go negative, which is cool. But for now, even is fine with me. So here's a nice distribution. And now that we've got a matrix, what if we use that as the source for another ricochet? So staying organized, let's again name this secondary. And then create a extensions, brand new ricochet, move it after, keep the order of operations going. When we remote link into things, it's a good idea to put them in the order of operations, just like the tracer object. Now in this case, this ricochet should be doing what? Well, it's just doing its own thing. I want it to collide with objects, and that object will be the text. But then I want to not start from the orientation of Z+, but instead based off of a matrix. That matrix will be this matrix secondary, and I'll drag that in. And the instant that I do, we are now shooting a laser from every one of those matrices, and it bounces off the geometry of the letter R and off into space. But now we get a whole bunch of those different lines. So right out of the gate, that's working very nicely for us. Now, I'm going to say that we don't want the length. Again, we want count. And I'm going to say a count of 1, just so it doesn't accidentally bounce multiple times. And now, only if it's colliding with the letter does it generate the line, and it also terminates as soon as it reaches it. Now, we've got a lot of options here. We could grab that matrix and change the start and end position, which is going to change exactly how they line up. We could change the count and make more or less of them if we were inclined. But for now, I think let's just add some randomness to these. They're all kind of perfectly hitting this object, and I want some variation. We got a couple options here. First of all, they're all kind of spiraling out based on this curve. So what if instead, and I will temporarily turn off this ricochet so we can see the matrix object, instead of them just aligning with the path, I want them to target our original target. So with that matrix selected, I'll feed it a target effector. And as soon as I do, you see they're all rotated. But inside the effector, I'm going to say, hey, I want you to target an object, and the object will be that target null. Just to keep it organized, I'll move this target as a child of the target, just to keep it outside of that hierarchy. And now that they are targeting that position, I want there to be some randomness. So selecting the matrix secondary, feed in a random effector. It's going to offset them via their position, but going into parameter, say no, not position, but yes, rotation. And I want to rotate on H and P. So I'll type in something like 55, 55, which is a lot of rotation. B doesn't do anything. It will just spin them, and it won't visually look any different. But now these are randomly, well, they're targeting the center point, but then they're getting randomness on top of it. So turning back on our secondary ricochet, we should see some of them collide, but not too many. See, yeah, a couple lines are colliding. first of all, I want to rename this secondary, so I don't forget, secondary. Selecting the main thread, and if I move it around, we'll see different lines getting generated in different places. Undoing, we don't need that to be there. All right, let's get these deforming and arcing downward. Before I forget, let's give them some subdivision. So under spline, I'll enable. Again, linear intermediate points will be subdivided, 90, and then maximum length, I'll say 10 this time because these are a little bit smaller, so I want more detail. And that needs to deform, but I don't want to make it directly a child of it again. Actually, we can make it directly a child now that I think about it. So if I make a duplicate of this plain deform main thread, I can drop that in. It's going to look a bit crazy right now. Let's rename it secondary before I forget. And currently it's pushing down, but it looks a little bit weird. It is deforming, but it's weird because it's still based off of, under fall off, the main thread. I'm going to say, no, I want you based on this secondary thread. And if I drag that in, you'll immediately see them arc properly because they are referencing themselves as the fall off. Currently it's a little bit long, so under the effector strength, I can pull back on the strength to not go down quite as far. And let's get this secondary stuff. I'll move this random as a child of the secondary. And you know what, if we wanted to, we could even rename that. So let's say random secondary, then selecting the matrix and this Ricochet, I want to put them in the proper spot in the hierarchy. So not in the main thread, I want them to be below. And then actually the main thread, I want that to be in a null. So Alt-G, and this one can just be called web. In fact, why don't we call it web move? Because that is what we're going to ultimately be moving around. So there's the main thread. Underneath that, I want our secondary thread. And there we go. Now, if I grab this main web and I move it around, you'll see that depending on where I place it, we get all these nice secondary lines being generated, but once again, only if they're colliding with the model. Working awesome. I'm very pleased with this. It's so much fun to play around with. But look how easy it's going to be to add a third layer of these. So let's grab that secondary and just kind of place a few more of them, make sure that they're aiming. Maybe we don't want quite as much randomness. We'll pull back on the random. You see more threads get generated. So here is secondary. Here is secondary matrix. If I just copy and paste, make sure you don't drag, hold a control and duplicate, actually copy and paste, and that will automatically make all of their relative links like stick together properly. So now renaming these to tertiary, I can go and type in tertiary and copy that. And let's rename all of them so we just stay really organized. And this is the scene file you get, so I'm going to be extra organized. Inside here, we'll just rename all of those. Excellent. Now move them into the proper spot, which is just after our secondary. So our tertiary, I'm going to say, okay, the only thing you need to do is don't clone onto the main thread, clone onto the secondary thread. And the instant we do, we automatically get these lines and they're already deforming properly because we had copy and pasted the entire rig. So they are already self-referencing. The only thing we need to tweak is maybe there's a few too many. So I'm going to cut back on the count because, you know, as we get closer, we don't need as many secondary webs. And maybe they're pulling down a little bit far. So under the tertiary, I'll say don't deform as much. We'll just pull those back a bit and look at all of this wonderful detail we're getting just from a Ricochet and then a matrix and a Ricochet, then a matrix. And each one is cloning onto itself. So now selecting our web move, I can move it around and we get all these different webs just wrapping directly into the object. Like look how nice that is and how quick this is to move around. Even more fun is doing something like copy and pasting that entire rig, and I can scoot this off to the side. But even better is if we hold down control as we drag, it'll just make a duplicate of that rig, and I can start placing more and more webs anywhere and exactly where I want them to be. The entire rig is getting duplicated, so we do have the ability at any moment to go into any individual one and change its properties. Let's grab this and scoot it further away. But then say, hey, the secondary, I'm going to make a whole bunch more. And you can see secondary ones, we're getting more and more of them as I make more. And we could change exactly where they spread out. They could start out potentially back here. Remember, only if it collides does it generate. We could also make them really clustered up near the end. So we have so much control over that. And then inside of that, we can also go into its randomness and add more random in. So they'll be missing more, but they'll spread out more. Or we can start tightening them up. And you'll see there's more and more of them because we have a lot of threads. So each individual rig can be controlled via all of these effectors. I don't need that last one, but with all of these different webs duplicated, let's actually reorder them. Like I said, it's a good idea to make sure that everything's in the proper order. So moving those all to the very bottom of the rig because the text technically comes first. We have the ability to grab all of the webs at the same time, move them around, and they will all still be targeting the text, and only if the line happens to collide with it does it get generated. We can select the text and the target and move those around, and those will all now aim directly at that letter no matter where we move it. And yeah, that pretty much concludes this rig. I will be including this scene file on the web page. I think pretty much exactly this. Maybe I'll clean it up just a tiny little bit, but this will be ready for reverse engineering. And all you need to do is have Ricochet already installed for this to work. Make sure to go and check out part 2 of this video where we will continue this rig, and I will add on some secondary details, and we'll make it so that we can, via another matrix, create a bunch of these base webs so we don't have to keep on copy and pasting the main one, and it just creates even more fun stuff to play with. So see you in that secondary video. Bye.